If you're here for beer, you're in the wrong place. I apologize for the parking congestion today, but I think we're competing with the beer festival, and that's a hard competition. So good afternoon, and welcome to the second annual Cape and Islands Faith and Science Forum, entitled Cape Cod Climate Change, Taking Action. I'm Brian McGurk. I'm rector of this church, and along with Susan Starkey, the co-chair of the Faith Communities Environmental Network. FCN was founded several years ago by Dr. Paul Minas. We're a network of 25 faith communities on the Cape and Islands working towards a sustainable future. Our commitment is this: guided by the full range of our respective faiths and a common commitment to environmental justice, we educate, advocate, and share best practices to protect the environment. To use the words of one of today's speakers, Mary Evelyn Tucker, we believe there is a moral force and a spiritual energy at the heart of these traditions, which can contribute to the long-term solutions to our complex environmental problems. FCN has a seat and voice on the board of the Cape Cod Climate Change Collaborative, and they bring the different sectors of Cape Cod life and the Cape Cod community to work towards net zero goals. This is chaired by Dr. Rich Delaney, one of today's panelists, and Mon Cochran. Today, as in the past, we're honored to partner with the Woods Hole Research Center and its outstanding director, Dr. Philip Duffy, to present this forum. Let's simply say that religion and science has had a complicated history, an odd couple of sorts, two very different ways of understanding and experiencing the world, the head and the heart, so to speak. Yet, we need both ways, don't we? Mary Evelyn writes this: there is a realization at Yale and beyond that religious values and scientific knowledge are indispensable partners in finding environmental solutions. She adds this: religions press the moral dimensions of social justice issues. Science, technology, faith communities, government, business, education, transportation, energy, etc. All sectors of our community and society share the responsibility for the present and future well-being of the human family and our living world. This is the great work, quote unquote, what each person and community can contribute to a flourishing future. That great philosopher and musician, really, and environmentalist, Neil Young, said in a recent National Public Radio interview, he said this: mostly I'd like a lot of people to see what's going on with the planet. That's so obvious to me. I just don't know why people don't get it, or if they do get it, then why they don't get with it. Today, let's get it. Today, let's get with it. Our hope is today's forum will transform our thinking and inspire each one of us to take concrete action in the days ahead. We must all get involved and do it quickly. Please don't leave today's forum without joining an organization that is taking action for our common good. Senator Julian Cyr, a passionate voice for Cape Cod and its sustainability, will tell us how to get involved in the legislative process. The organizations represented by our panelists can and will get you involved. The Center for Coastal Studies, the Association for the Preservation of Cape Cod, 350 Cape Cod, the Sierra Club, Nauset High School, and there's many, many others. As will the organizations and informational tables in our parish hall. Please visit them during the intermission at the end of the service. They are Cape Light Compact, the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology, Lower Cape Indivisible, 5 Cs, and FCN. That's the Cape Cod Climate Change Collaborative. There is an urgent call to take action. We hope that today's forum will be informational, but also inspirational and transformational for our individual lives and the life of this world, for our souls and the soul of Mother Earth, so to speak. Now to introduce a man who is taking action, Dan Wolfe needs no introduction. I'm sure he has been described many times over by friend, but certainly not by foe, right? Along with his brother Jim, he embodies a person of action. I would describe him as a Renaissance kind of guy, pioneering electric planes, committed to democracy, a student of history, spiritually inquisitive, a committed citizen, an environmentalist. We're honored to welcome you, Dan, as our moderator. Welcome.
I have done a lot of speaking in different venues. This actually is a first for me. And I just want to say, with the distinguished guests that I'm going to be introducing and that we will be having a dialogue with today, it is really an honor for me and humbling to be part of this presentation. So Brian and Jill, I want to thank you for inviting me. Phil, I want to thank the Center for sponsoring us. A couple of brief opening remarks that are very personal to me. Because this is interfaith. My personal story, I was born in a Jewish home, both parents Jewish. They sent me to a Quaker school for 13 years. I married a woman, Heidi, who is here. She is a Catholic. She practices Buddhism. And the only place we could find to raise our 3 daughters spiritually was a Universalist Unitarian church. So our family actually spent time at the First Parish Church over in Brewster, where I'm sure there are a lot of people here who did. But the reason I tell that is not only to amuse, but to just say that there are so many woven pieces of fabric around all of those religions. And that's why we're here today. Interfaith is compassion. Interfaith is about celebrating our humanity, but doing it in ways that are mindful of future generations and each other in loving, thoughtful, and compassionate ways. And I think the reason the turnout is what it is here today, and the reason this issue has become so electrified, is we are deeply concerned about the today, but also about tomorrow. And I'm so excited that we have actually a high school student, Montana is here today, and you're going to hear from her a little bit later about what the younger generations are doing. Martin Luther King in the late 1950s made the quote that a lot of you have heard, which is, "The moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice and truth." And I wonder what Dr. King would be saying today, because that was 70 years ago, and that was early in the modern civil rights movement. And if you look at where that movement has gone in the 70 years, and you look at that arc, there are successes. We in Massachusetts had an African-American governor, the country had an African-American president, all good. But if you look at things like infant mortality rates, wealth and income gap, all of the indicators, you would say that arc has been too long. And I would say the same thing about the women's movement as well, that so many of us were involved in generations ago. That we're at 82 cents on a dollar, when you remember where we were in the late 70s at 69 cents on a dollar. If we use the same thought process and the same activism and have the same arc on this issue that we're here to discuss today, we will literally be underwater in 50 years. It doesn't work. So part of the frame today, we're going to hear from scientists, and we're going to hear from Mary Evelyn, who is just an amazing, articulate person on the connection between morality, spirituality, and this movement. But we have to rethink the paradigm of understanding the problem and what that means relative to the call for action. I have been a pilot flying over Cape Cod for 42 years. God, does that make me feel old. I learned to fly right up the street here at the Chatham Airport in 1977. And I will tell you, the front row seat that I have had watching this place change due to the changes in the environment and due to the changes in the footprint of human growth and development on this peninsula is a huge, huge call to action. And that has been an amazing front row seat. And this morning, my wife and I took our dog on a walk in one of our favorite places, the Bell's Neck Conservation Area in Harwich, which we've lived there for the last 35 years and walked there for 35 years. It looks literally like a war zone. And that is a result of the tornadoes that we had this summer, the nor'easters that we had. So if you look at anything from these conservation areas in our backyard here in Chatham to Ballston Beach up in Truro, you see what the impact is, and it is dramatic. So the conversation today, and I hope it is a conversation, you all have cards. I hope you're writing some good questions for our panelists, is really going to be about that. And the first session this morning, and I'm going to take moderator liberty here, we started 15 minutes late. We're going to go 15 minutes late into the break, because this is, you know, we could be here for 10 hours, but we only have an hour, so we're going to use 15 minutes of the break because we deserve it. So please write questions that you have. They'll be brought up to the front, pass them to the center of the row, we'll collect them. First up, we have Phil Duffy, who is the head of the research center at Woods Hole Oceanographic. One of those incredible scientific and intellectual places and entities that we have in our backyard to help define this issue so that we can be leaders globally and moving forward. Phil?
Well, Dan, thank you, and thank you all for being here on a beautiful fall afternoon in Cape Cod. I really am happy to have the opportunity to be here. You know, about 10 or 15 years ago, my wife said to me, who's very smart, said to me, you know, sweetheart, nobody cares what you think. You need to work with religious leaders, and you need to work with business leaders. People care what they think, and she was right as usual. One of the things we've done and continue to do at Woods Hole Research Center is to work with faith leaders and with leaders in the private sector, in the world of business and finance. And the reason I value the importance of that is that firstly, those folks can reach folks that I can't reach. My wife was right. And secondly, of course, we all have to be part of the solution to climate change. If we're going to solve this, we all have to get on the end of an oar and pull. Anything that gets more people and a broader set of people involved in addressing the issue is a good thing in my view. So what I'm going to do in the next 12 minutes, since I'm the scientist in the room, is set the stage by talking about some of the science and how that provides a context and a framing for talking about some of the issues of equity and justice. And I'll start with urgency, and you've probably heard that it's very urgent to address the problem of climate change, and that's true. And that urgency has a very simple basis in science, and that basis is the long lifetime of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And I'm sure you all know that the main driver of climate change is the buildup of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And the long lifetime means that if you put carbon dioxide in the atmosphere through, say, fossil fuel burning or deforestation, it stays there for a very long time. It stays there for a time that's longer than human lifetimes. And that simple fact has profound implications for policy. And the implications for policy is that essentially climate change never gets better. That is, if we were to stop emitting greenhouse gases completely today, climate change would not get better. It would only stop getting worse. And so a policy, a wait-and-see type policy, where if you say, gee, I'm not convinced this is such a problem, this doesn't seem so bad to me, let's wait and see if it gets bad and then we'll do something, is a terrible idea. And it's a terrible idea because if it gets to the point where you don't like it, and it's already at that point in my opinion, but once it gets to the point where you think this world really isn't okay, it's too late to do anything about it. You're stuck with it for hundreds of years. So we talk about climate policy targets in terms of increases in the globally average temperature. And as I'll say in a minute or two, I think those kinds of targets are really approximations or guesses as to where we think there are critical thresholds and tipping points in the climate system. I'll talk about those. But lately, we've talked about a target of limiting the increase in global average temperature. In other words, limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, you probably know we've already caused about 1 degree of warming, so that means about 0.5 degree to go. And at the rate at which we're adding greenhouse gases to the atmosphere now, in about 10 years, we'll probably pass the threshold of 1.5 degrees Celsius. And with that comes some consequences, which I'll describe one or two of in just a moment. But that's the sort of time frame that we have. We have decades, not centuries, to bring this problem under control. And another fundamental point from science is this, and I call it getting to zero. And that is that what we need to do to bring this problem under control is to totally eliminate human emissions of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. We need to completely stop emitting carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. And the simple reason is that if we don't, they keep accumulating in the atmosphere, the climate keeps getting warmer. So that's a big challenge. And you've probably heard talk about net zero emissions. And what that means is that some sectors of the economy we think will be relatively difficult to decarbonize. And I'm going to mention aviation as an example, although Dan Wolf has done some very innovative things with electric-powered airplanes. But I think most folks think that commercial aviation, for example, is going to be very slow to decarbonize. And so what that means, if we want to stabilize climate, we need to find ways to offset the continued emissions from sectors like commercial aviation, so that we have, in fact, net zero additions of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. I'll say on an optimistic note, so last month I was down in New York City at Climate Week, which is basically a hootenanny that coincides with a climate hootenanny that coincides with the United Nations General Assembly meeting. So it means if you think New York is chaotic on a normal day, it's that much worse during Climate Week. But I sat in on panel discussions with heads of state and with corporate CEOs, and admittedly these are not necessarily your average head of state or your average corporate CEO, that those who chose to go to Climate Week. But what gave me hope was that I heard these folks talk about making commitments to completely eliminate greenhouse gas emissions from either their company or their nation. And that's, in my view, that's real progress. I think 5 years ago, or maybe even 3 years ago, we would have heard folks talk about reducing emissions by 20% and then high-fiving each other. And of course, 20% isn't good enough. So let me turn now to the concept of thresholds and tipping points in the climate system, and use that as a way of framing a conversation I hope we have about equity, and in particular, intergenerational equity. And the concept of thresholds and tipping points, I think, is super important, and I think is something that the scientific community should be very focused on understanding better, and our work at Woods Hole Research Center is focused on understanding many of those thresholds and tipping points. I further feel that the climate policy should be aimed around avoiding these thresholds and tipping points. And I'm going to give you an example of each to illustrate the concept, and they both actually involve the Arctic. And I'll start with a tipping point, and you probably all know about Arctic permafrost. 24% of northern hemisphere land area is permafrost. That means frozen ground. The name permafrost suggests permanently frozen ground. Problem is, it's not. As you probably know, the Arctic is warming 2 or 3 times faster than the rest of the planet. And as the Arctic warms, the frozen ground, the permafrost thaws, that organic matter which has been frozen in many cases for tens of thousands of years, decays. As it decays, it emits greenhouse gases. And this is a self-reinforcing cycle because the warming causes release of greenhouse gases, which causes more warming and so forth. So it feeds on itself. And what's particularly, and there's multiple examples of these so-called, we call them positive feedbacks, but that name suggests that they're good. It just means it's a self-reinforcing cycle. There's multiple examples of those. Permafrost is perhaps the most worrisome, simply because the amount of carbon in permafrost is just enormous. And to give you some context for that, the amount of carbon in permafrost is more than is in untapped fossil fuel reserves. It's probably twice what's in the atmosphere now. It's probably 3 times what is contained in all the forests of the world. So it's a potentially enormous amplifier on climate change, and it's really critical, therefore, that we not let that self-reinforcing cycle get going in any significant way, because once it does, it's very, very difficult to stop. So that's a tipping point. And I'll give you an example of a threshold. This also comes from the Arctic. You know all about the Greenland ice sheet. Probably the Greenland ice sheet has enough ice to raise global sea level by something like, over 20 feet, 7 meters of 7 meters of global sea level. You probably also know the Greenland ice sheet is decaying, it's melting, it's shedding, it's losing mass. We know that. We know that from satellite measurements. We also know from satellite measurements that the rate of decay of the Greenland ice sheet is accelerating. It's losing mass, and it's losing mass faster and faster. Now, somewhere in there's a threshold, okay? By which I mean at some temperature, we will commit to the eventual complete melting of the Greenland ice sheet. Now, that won't happen in a week, it won't happen in a year, it probably won't happen in a century. It'll probably take 200 or 300 years for that massive ice sheet to completely melt. But the threshold, the point beyond which that becomes inevitable and unstoppable, that may be very close. And in fact, we may have already crossed that threshold. And there's no way we would necessarily know. There's not an alarm that goes off somewhere when the Greenland ice sheet becomes doomed. So again, this is a threshold that we mustn't cross, because once we do, we've committed our descendants to literally an altered landscape where many coastal cities become uninhabitable. So this obviously raises issues of equity, and in particular, intergenerational equity. And I'll close then with some thoughts on how we address those issues. And I guess I'll start by saying that science doesn't try to do that, okay? What science tries to do is illustrate the future, or really illustrate alternative futures, meaning if we have strong climate policies, this is what the world could look like. If we have weak climate policies, this is what the world will look like. And what we do is illustrate the choices, and we can tell you what you need to do to achieve one future versus another future, but we don't try to put values on things. We don't use the word should very often. That's not the role of science to try to do that. On the other hand, economics, I think, in some sense, does try to do that. It does try to put values on things. I think it doesn't work well in many respects. And one of those is that I think economics doesn't do well at putting values on common goods, like clean air and clean water. In fact, economics doesn't do well at putting a value on carbon pollution, and that's why we're here today. That's why we have a climate change problem. Furthermore, I think economics doesn't do a good job at valuing things in the future, okay? I mean, the concept in economics that are used to try to address that is discount rates and net present value. And those kinds of concepts, I think, make sense on relatively short time horizons, right? So if I'm trying to decide, should I start collecting Social Security benefits now and get a relative, a slightly lower benefit, or should I wait 3 or 4 years and get a higher benefit? That's a question that economics and net present value and discount rates, I think, can usefully address. But when the issue is it more important for me to be able to drive a Hummer today versus more important for people 300 years from now to live in Miami or to live where Miami is today? How can economics address that? I think on such timescales where the decision maker and the folks who are impacted by the decision are completely different individuals, I think economics fails. And this is why I think there's a super important role for communities of faith, and this is why I think we need to be willing to talk about issues of equity and issues of justice and issues of morality. And I'll just close by saying, quoting my friend Bob Inglis. Many of you may know him. He was a congressman from South Carolina and is now evangelizing among conservatives about climate change. And Bob says, and he's right, Bob says climate change isn't just a head issue, it's also a heart issue. And that's why we're here today. Thanks very much.
There's a reason why when I went to my sock drawer today, I pulled out my Albert Einstein socks. And I actually do have them. They have Albert Einstein. Anybody else here have Albert Einstein socks? The reason is, if you remember back to high school, science, right? It's about hypothesis, experiment, conclusion, or outcome and conclusion. It's science. It's not ideology. We're not ideologues. We're practical. We're empirical. And we do a lot of hard work. And Phil, I want to thank you and the Institute for being leaders in all of that. Clearly, there are bridges that need to be built. And one of the reasons I mentioned Albert Einstein is, as much of a scientist as he was also a person of religion, who said there are some answers that don't come from scientific experiment and that we can't derive through formula and through experiment. And so he was a religious person. But the next speaker, Mary Evelyn Tucker, is the co-founder and the co-director of the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology. And what a great discussion we're going to have with Mary Evelyn about the relationship between what Phil talked about and the house we're in today and the interfaith movement on ecology. So thank you very much, Mary Evelyn.
Thank you so much. It's really an honor to be here, and especially with Brian and Diane and all the organizers. I appreciate what it takes to do this, as I've organized more than 35 conferences, so I know it's a tremendous amount of work. And the fact that you all are here on this beautiful day, as Phil said, is also a great tribute to the importance of the issue. I think we would not deny that we are in perhaps the most critical moment in human history. And we've got to see it on that level. We've got to accept that these challenges are formidable. They're not going to be easy. Ed Wilson at Harvard, great scientist, says we're going through an hourglass of extinction. We are in a sixth extinction. 1 million species are at risk. So the big picture to me is climate change is the face of the environmental movement, but so is biodiversity loss, so is toxicity, water here on the Cape, etc., etc. So every scientific report is giving us this very dire news. So is every newspaper as we pick it up. I call it the sad, bad news. It's quite overwhelming, right? It leaves me sleepless at night. And those of you who have children and grandchildren, I'm sure that's the case too. My husband and I don't have children, We both did PhDs. It was a long, hard haul. But we consider our students at Yale as our children. Fantastic. And we think we're at this moment of an intergenerational handshake. That's why Montana's presence here is so important, and she's going to make everybody stand up, I'm sure, for her message. So this notion, then, that it's a dire moment, but there's also a great awakening. You know, the Northeast was swept by Jonathan Edwards' idea of a great awakening, a religious moment. And that is what I think will get us through this hourglass, in part. There are no clear answers. You're not going to go home with 10 ways to save the world, do your recycling, change your light bulbs. We've got to think big, we've got to think systemically, and we've got to think long-term. Long-term. Americans are very pragmatic. We love the answer. Take it home. I'll do it. I'll feel good. I'll burn out in 3 weeks' time. This is a profound spiritual revolution of who we are as humans. The future of the planet and all future generations are at risk. Greta, we just say her name and something comes to light. She's a luminous being, a 16-year-old child who has revolutionized this moment with climate strikes all over the world. Her address at the UN was breathtaking. How dare you take my youth? How perceptive she is, and why is it that this truth to power is getting so much traction? And that is why the Sunrise Movement, which is a youth movement, deserves our support. That is a take-home. The Extinction Rebellion movement in the UK hasn't gotten the news here, but it's spread all over the world, and it's driven largely by young people. Life is at risk, and their lives are at risk. So this new alliance, I think, of science and religion is perhaps one of the most important ways forward through this hourglass. The collaboration of the facts that science is giving us for decades on this issue, and the values that religious traditions have fomented, congested, composted. These values aren't certain, they're changing all the time, and they have to be in relation to these extraordinary facts, models, studies. We should take our hat off to scientists who are in the Arctic and Antarctic and glacier areas, who are studying these areas at the risk of their health, at the risk of their family life. It's extraordinary, the work of the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the largest scientific study in human history. People calling each other all over the world, late at night, early in the morning, making these reports. They must be heard. And every country in the world, except ours, is on board with climate change and the IPCC report. We are not out until 2020. The threat is there, but we are not yet out. And many municipalities, yours can be one of them, we are still in. Check out that movement. We are still in. So, I would suggest that what is needed is ecology and ethics